I think debates like this one tonight are crucially important for socialists and for the left in general to be able to have. I consider everybody, even though I just met Dustin tonight, I consider everybody sitting at this table to be comrades in struggle. And this is a debate really about strategy and which way forward. And I expect that everybody considers all the folks in this room to be on the same side of that struggle. And I think sharp debate is really important, and I hope that people agree with that, but that it's also comradely. We've been able to do that thus far, and hopefully it can continue. And we're going to have a number of sharp debates in the future. So this is like, you know, practicing that. So think about it in those terms. And let's try to be good at it. Also, just so people know, this debate is sponsored by Jacobin Magazine, by the Green Party, by DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and ISO, the International Socialist Organization.
All right, we're here to debate, but I do think, like, sort of in the spirit of what Lichi was just saying, it's actually good to establish some of what we probably don't have to debate, some of what we all agree on. Does anybody here hate Donald Trump? Does anybody here support Planned Parenthood?
Yeah.
Anybody here think that all refugees should be welcome in this country? I'm not just saying that for cheap applause. I'm saying we should remember us saying that right now, because in a few months there's going to be a lot of people saying that we don't, actually. How many of you here are pretty sure you're not going to support Hillary Clinton, even if she gets the nomination? Well, if you're in that category, then I'm talking about you, and I'm talking about me. Because in a few months, we will in all likelihood, unfortunately, be facing a presidential race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump or some other loathsome Republican. And that's not because Hillary Clinton isn't going to win, in all likelihood, the Democratic nomination because she has a better message than Bernie Sanders. And it's certainly not because Bernie's social democratic policies somehow don't connect with women or African Americans, all the sort of crap you see Hillary supporters putting out. It's the reason why, in almost all likelihood, Hillary Clinton is going to get that nomination is because the Democratic Party is not a Democratic Party. Well, higher? Louder? Okay. It's a very misnamed party because it's not a Democratic party. It's run by money primaries, connections to the corporate media, and rigged internal structures like superdelegates who are all already pledging that they're going to support Hillary Clinton. So if you don't support Hillary, in a few months when we have that race, in all likelihood between Hillary Clinton and a loathsome Republican, and you don't support Hillary Clinton, you're going to be accused of supporting Trump. Because that's the logic of lesser evilism. You're going to be accused of not caring about Planned Parenthood. You're going to be accused. It doesn't matter if you were one of the people who were at the protest against Donald Trump last night in Columbus Circle, or even one of the people who helped organize that protest against Donald Trump. You'll be accused of not caring about the consequences of Donald Trump, and you'll be accused of that by some people whose only response to Donald Trump is to say, "Ooh, Donald Trump's terrible. Send more money to my campaign," which is basically what Hillary Clinton is saying about Donald Trump after being friends with Donald Trump for 20 years, and you know, just to say. And unfortunately, in a few months, and I'm being the bearer of bad news here, I know. Unfortunately, in a few months, Bernie Sanders and most of the upper-level organizers in his campaign are going to tell their supporters that they need to now get behind Hillary Clinton to prevent that horrible Republican victory, as I totally lose my place. And the pressure on people who think that we need to build something independent of that is going to be enormous, okay? There's going to be emails every day coming from liberal organizations talking about the latest horrible thing that Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio said. There's going to be articles written in different liberal magazines blasting people on the left who aren't getting in line with the Hillary Clinton campaign, saying that we don't care about deportations because we won't support the party that's deported more people than anyone in history. They'll be saying we don't care about refugees because we're not lining up behind the person who is Secretary of State in the administration that created more refugees than we've seen at any time since the end of World War II. That's, now let me stop for a second. Why am I talking so much about Hillary Clinton? We're here to debate Bernie Sanders. It's because I'm cheating. I can do that. No, what I'm actually trying to do is I want to pull the lens back a little bit to talk about what I really do feel like if we can look ahead not just to the next primaries, but to the coming 12 months, is going to be the defining challenge for the left in this country, which is fighting for a left that's independent of the Hillary Clinton campaign and a Democratic Party that thrives, that exists from generation to generation on sucking in the new generation of unions and grassroots movements and activists and turning them in really to partisan hacks. The kind of people that say that the war in the Middle East is a war crime when George Bush does it, and when Barack Obama does it, don't have as much to say, right? That's what it means to take movements and turn it into partisan BS. We need a left that's much better than that, right? Which I think is what most people in this room, so I'm not accusing people in this room of not saying that. I think that's the sentiment that brings us together and people together. There's a strategic debate about that. And so the challenge of trying to build an independent left over the next 12 months, it means a couple things. One, it's gonna mean in November, making sure there is an electoral independent thing to choose, which is I think where the Green Party and Jill Stein's campaign comes in. I know Gloria is going to talk more about that. But it's also going to mean fighting for our movements, our social movements, to stay independent and to stay out in the streets, for people in Chicago to keep fighting to get Rahm Emanuel out of there because of his complicitness in the murder and cover-up of Black and Latino men and women from the police department. And it also means continuing and building rallies against Islamophobia and for refugees, and then working and fighting inside the organizing meetings to make sure that the message and what we're saying isn't just, this is all Trump. Trump is so horrible. That people who are going to these protests actually get to hear and think about the role that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton as a Secretary of State played in laying the basis for that Islamophobia. And that there's going to be enormous pressure as it becomes. But if you do that, you're going to weaken Hillary Clinton's campaign, and then we'll be stuck with this. The pressure will really be strong. So to me, the question tonight that we're debating is whether or not supporting the Bernie Sanders campaign helps or hurts that effort of building that kind of left. And I think it doesn't. Surprisingly, that's my side of the debate. For a couple of reasons. One, because like I've already implied, I think for all the kind of wildly encouraging success that the Sanders campaign has had, it's building something that for the most part won't then exist a few months after, by the time we head into the general election. It's not building something that's lasting and is independent. And secondly, because as many really amazing messages as Bernie Sanders is getting out there around economic inequality and getting people talking about the S word, which I want to come back to a little bit in the end, I unfortunately think it's also giving new life to the idea that we can take over the Democratic Party from within, that it can be a tool for us, and then that hope is going to be transferred into the Hillary Clinton campaign as well. And I think that's something we need to disagree with. That's the heart of, I think, what we need to be debating tonight. It's about the nature of the Democratic Party, whether or not it can be used by the left or whether or not it inevitably uses us. And I don't think the debate is about...
3 minutes left.
Okay, cool. I don't think it's a debate between purity and practicality, and I hope we don't take too much time, because I think that ends up being a straw man kind of an argument. For one thing, the reason why we in the International Socialist Organization aren't supporting Bernie Sanders' campaign, it's not about purity. It's not because he's not revolutionary enough. We were knee-deep in the Ralph Nader's Green Party campaign, other campaigns of people that aren't revolutionary socialists, but we're about building a lasting and permanent independent formations from our two-party system. The other reason is because I think, let's be honest, neither side in this debate is practical. We both have incredibly long odds that we're facing us. On the one hand, on my side, the last successful third party in this country was 150 years ago when Abraham Lincoln won an election on the Republican Party, about stopping the spread of slavery. On the other hand, the last time socialists successfully entered the Democratic Party and moved it to the left and not had themselves move to the right was never. So, if you want to be practical, you really shouldn't be a socialist. At all, right? We have long odds and a task that's set out. But let me say that for the last point, because that does bring up, I think, a really important question about Sanders. Is Sanders making it more practical to be a socialist? Isn't he popularizing socialism? And to an extent, I think that's definitely true. I mean, I know being in the ISO, I've seen more people coming around asking about socialism because of the Sanders campaign. But we should be clear, first of all, that really didn't start with Sanders. That started with the Great Recession and in 2010 and 11, that's when polls started showing significant minorities and even pluralities among young people, African Americans, Latinos favoring socialism more than capitalism. Sanders has given that an electoral expression, and he's increased the number of people talking about socialism. That's great. But the thing that's been missing for the last 5 years and that Sanders' campaign has not actually moved us forward on is giving some definition to what socialism can mean and how socialists can organize. And in fact, to me, the danger of the Sanders campaign, for all that think that it's really providing opportunities, is it actually puts forward the Democratic Party as an organizational possibility for socialism, that this is a way that we can organize. And then that in turn puts pressure on what Sanders is able to say or feels like he can say socialism is. So in the last 6 months, he has gone from his reference points of socialism from Eugene Debs to Denmark to the New Deal, right? And it's going, we have, and I'm hoping it doesn't get all the way to Jimmy Carter. So, which I don't think, but there's a pressure to conform socialism into what the Democratic Party will allow. And to me, that's something we don't want to squander this incredible. I share the sentiment that I think a lot of Sanders supporters have of like, oh my God, this is such an exciting moment. For all the stuff I've been saying about how this next year is going to be so challenging with the pressures of lesser evilism, what am I like done?
You're done.
Okay, I think we have an incredible opportunity too, and we don't want to squander that. We actually want to make socialism stand for something and not be part of the same party as the war on terror and deportations, etc.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much to the ISO for organizing this, and Jen for inviting me. Some of you have heard me talk on this topic before, and I'm not going to offer a lot in addition. So what I did was I took my original speech and I cut it to its bare bones. No bad jokes, no puns, no anecdotes from my childhood. So just the basic points. I support Bernie Sanders, and I think you should too. But first, let me direct my attention to my fellow Bernie Sanders supporters and just briefly say the way in which I think we should not support Sanders. We should not aim to transform the Democratic Party or to look for new blocks within it to try to realign or capture. We should recognize that even though out of the workers who do vote, and many of them for very good reason stay at home because they don't see much of a difference when they do, even though the majority of them who do vote for the Democratic Party, this alone isn't an argument for it. Their involvement in the party is a passive one. The Democratic Party is a party of capital structurally. It functions to weaken the fighting capability of workers when any viable program, revolutionary or nice and reformist like my own, requires working class political consciousness and mobilization. And also I have to say, there's a certain way in which one should not oppose the Sanders campaign, even if you're going to come down against it. I think Danny and others in the ISO do this correctly. In other words, if you notice, Danny didn't line by line oppose Sanders at the level of program. He made a structural argument about the nature of the Democratic Party, and he conceded that in many ways, let's say someone like Ralph Nader, if you compare the program of Nader in 2000 with the program of Sanders, Sanders' program is more progressive. So if we're going to oppose Sanders, I don't think it should be at the level of dissecting his program. I think it has to be at this pitched at that structural level. So in other words, I do share the desire of most here, I would assume, for working class political independence, militant direct action outside of electoral politics, and also rank and file driven action in the labor movement, and obviously to have bottom-up democratic social movements. Why then am I supporting Bernie Sanders? Well, I asked myself 3 questions back in April, when this was just a theoretical question. And those 3 questions were, 1, is the Sanders campaign pulling the discourse to the left or to the right? 2, what is the level of social movement activity compared to, especially the past periods of democratic cooptation? Is there a reasonable fear that the Sanders campaign could co-opt energy from movements and neutralize it within the tent of the Democratic Party? And 3, finally, what is the current level of strength of the socialist left? Are we capable of swaying a national election, either on the one hand by running an independent socialist campaign on the one side, or on the other following those who are already banging the drum for progressives for Hillary campaign to keep the right out? And this has been my inbox the last 2 days, and I'm sure yours too. So my answer to these questions, I think, have been confirmed, at least in my mind, by the experience of the last few months. The Sanders campaign is indeed playing a progressive role, bringing issues of income inequality, the state of the social safety net, the malfeasance of elites, and the need for a new wave of unionization to the fore. He's doing this as someone who describes himself as a socialist, helping to start a conversation about what that means today. Many socialist groups and outlets across the country can only speak concretely about the Democratic Socialists of America, of which I'm a member, and Jacobin, of which I'm an editor, have benefited tremendously from this conversation. He's opening up space, in other words, for this discussion about socialism. I could quote all sorts of polling and figures to that end, but you could Google it. I don't have much time. But I know that that's also not really exactly the question at hand, because one can see this as opening up space and relate well to it, like I think many members of the ISO have, without necessarily supporting that campaign. I will simply just say that based on my experience, I found it rather easy to start a conversation with people by honestly saying, I support Bernie Sanders, but rather than I imagine the conversation that other comrades have, which probably goes something like, I understand why you support Bernie Sanders, but. My answer to my second question is that even though there are burgeoning movements that many of us are engaged with, we hope will grow in the future, at the moment the current level of struggle and the broader situation of the country does not mirror the periods of great upsurge and co-optation, the populists of the 1890s, the labor movement of the New Deal era, the New Left of the 60s and 70s, where many ended up in the McCarthy and McGovern campaigns. These are times when the possibility of independent political action were forestalled and corralled in the Democratic Party. That was a time when even the far left made mistakes, and many of them confused the bureaucratic structures of official reformism with the embryo, some type of workers' party that they could turn the Democratic Party into one. The times now are different. Sanders supporters on the left don't call for such a strategy. There's no structural basis for that even being conceivable. Furthermore, I could see absolutely no proof that the Sanders campaign has co-opted or done anything to limit the appeal of social movements that do exist today. In fact, I would argue that it actually has brought thousands who were previously not as engaged, more actively engaged into the sphere of at least broad liberal left political organizing in a positive way. And to answer my last question, I think the socialist left is weak. I'm sorry if that surprised you all, but not much of a surprise. But there's of course no use in being defeatist about it. But we have maybe, and I was arguing before, and apparently this is a highball, 2,000 active socialists, active in organizations, socialist organizations in a country of 330 million people and counting. So that's a staggering number. It has no comparison in the history of any capitalist country since the dawn of the workers' movement. So we're making history, which is, I guess, a nice thing, right? And obviously many of us are doing things about it. I applaud the work of the International Socialist Organization, Socialist Alternative, the Democratic Socialists of America, and others. It's necessary and often thankless. But at the moment, our level of strength means that we're not capable of meaningfully impacting a national presidential election. In this situation, this inability to impact the national election, I think it demands tactical flexibility when it means approaching the question of Sanders. So in other words, my answer to those three questions is why I believed at the time and now believe even more fervently that our best bet at the moment as it relates to national electoral politics is to support and engage with the Sanders campaign as open socialists. We, in other words, have more to gain than we do to lose. Bernie is leading millions of people to look at socialism. We have 2,000 at best socialists active in groups. We won't even have to be that good at engaging with them to see a dramatic difference and influx of membership and interest. And beyond that, we also have the ability to make interventions as best we can among this new audience. I think this is something that Dustin can talk about more in depth. About the meaning of socialism, what kind of movements we would actually need to build and win any sort of reform. So we have little to lose, and obviously since this is not an argument what I'm presenting or what I imagine what Dustin will present for subsuming the Democratic Party or a call to relate to it as some sort of true home of working class activity or an attempt to realign it. This is kind of a one-off engagement with a presidential race of a self-described socialist. So we can make these tactical decisions and support Sanders in the national race, while also building independent political formations at the local level. That's true in Chicago, definitely. It's also true, I think, in New York, where many of us, for example, that I know, who supported the Hawkins-Jones campaign are now supporting Sanders, and obviously would be happy to support and actively support anything like the Hawkins-Jones campaign in the future. You can look at examples like in the 1930s when a lot of labor activists voted for Roosevelt were also heavily involved with building local labor parties to see that there can be this dichotomy between making tactical decisions at the national level and building independent formations at the local level. So essentially I call for treating the Sanders campaign like a tactical parenthesis without losing the track of the need for independent political action, without training people in the tradition of independent political action. I still think there's an intervention the socialists can make wholeheartedly, and that on some we have more to gain than we do to lose. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone who organized this and for all of you to be here. For the previous speakers. It's a little strange for me because I'm going to talk from a political party perspective, but I do consider myself an eco-socialist. I was a member of an organized socialist group. That's another story we can have over a beer later. But I also think that there's two audiences, and I actually don't know. I'm not going to ask people to raise their hand about who's a socialist, who's a group, because that's a weird thing. But there are two. My example of there being two audiences when we're trying to have this debate is a couple of months ago, I guess there's a time where you could change your registration in New York State to become a member of a particular party. You change it and then be able to vote because you need a year for that to happen. And I got on my voicemail, along with many other Green Party members, an enthusiastic young person who called me from another state to remind me about I needed to change my registration from Green to Democrat in enough time to be able to vote for Bernie in the Democratic primary. He was very excited, but when I called him back, he never called me, so I don't know with it. On my way in here, I bumped into a young man who I see at different demos. He's actually a registered Green. I'll just call him Joe, so he is anonymous. And I told him where I was doing, and he said, well, it should be really interesting. He goes, so I changed my registration from from Green to Democrat, because this is the tone. I really, I feel the burn, and, I don't know what it's going to mean. That's not going to mean anything really, but, I feel the burn, and, I'm going to change it right back. And, okay, I don't want to go into a whole thing about that, but it's just kind of like, so there's two audiences there, right? They're real, they're experienced, they're political, they're people who consider themselves socialist groups or not groups, and I would say, yes, there are very few socialists in groups, but how many socialists are out there that are not in groups? Or maybe they don't realize they're socialists, but if you talk to them about the kinds of things that socialism means, they are on board, and so maybe those are the people that we're talking about. And I think as a leader in the Green Party, who I will also by disclosure say I am a senior advisor to the Jill Stein campaign, who's one of the leading Democrat, the leading recognized candidate in the Green Party, although she won't be a nominee until much later on next year, that we do have to compare and contrast Sanders' program to a Green Party presidential candidate's program, because there are quite a few similarities. And there are some big differences, and I'm not going to go into that here. People can pretty much figure that out. I will say, for those of you who don't know a lot about the Green Party, that it is the only independent left party with a national, presence. Okay, that doesn't mean there aren't other smaller parties around doing other things around the state. It is a national presence, and that really means something when you have a candidate. So if my comrade Howie Hawkins was here, he would start talking about William Jennings, start back there and lead all the way to Jesse Jackson. I'm just going to say, as one example, of Howard Dean, right? So what happened to the Deaniacs? They became MoveOn.org, Change.org, this.org, all these kinds of things. So what does that mean for people who got excited about the Sanders campaign? How many will become socialists? How many will come to the Green Party? How many are going to kind of do that same thing, right? Which is there's hope for the Democratic Party in between the big elections when we elect somebody that we're really disappointed in, right? That's what we do. And so to have a national campaign for an independent candidate, like a Green Party candidate at this moment, that, you know, maybe someday there'll be other parties that can do that. We have to start now. Those resources of money and people and visibility and talking to people have to start now, not later. Not when Sanders starts to tank for whatever reason, whether the Democratic Party does that, or whether it's just, you know, kind of what Hillary's going to bring in terms of the money and the superdelegates and a rigged system, right? Let's face it, it's that also. And I agree that we can look at local campaigns and we can do something and do maybe something else nationally, but really we're small. Whether we're in an organized group or not, whether we're green or not, those of us who believe that their things need to change, that this is a rotten system and people are suffering and dying because of it, means that we have to step up and put the small amount of resources that we have to build that now. That doesn't mean that we don't look at the local level. Remember, in 2017, in all the off-election years, what's the most important thing is running candidates on the local level, from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the single healthcare movement, from the Stop Mass Incarceration movement, from all the movements that the Green Party and the groups in this room and the individuals in this room have been working with and dedicating time to, because that is what important is. We are a part of that, right? The Bernie Sanders campaign is a tool. So for some socialists, it's a tool to recruit or to talk about socialism. To the Democratic Party, that campaign is a tool also to keep people in the Democratic Party. So electoral work in general, electoral campaigns is a tool that socialists and those on the left need to use more. We're not good enough yet. We had the Sawant campaign and we had some good results in terms of some Green Party campaigns, and Howie was a fabulous campaign along with Brian Jones. But we have to really work that muscle. We have to know what it means. If people remember, maybe it was during the Hawkins campaign, there was about 80 people at the Commons. And there was a real excitement about, there were two socialists running for governor, lieutenant governor in the Green Party line. People wanted to talk about that and figure out how that was going to work. Well, what happened? I have those 80 names. Well, some of them were parts of organizations that stayed together and working in the Hawkins campaign, and maybe some individuals. But some people said, well, can we make a separate thing that's not connected to the Green Party? It's like, no, you could, but we're running a campaign here. We need people to get signatures, raise money, have house parties, work on voter identification. All that stuff is the nitty-gritty, dirty laundry that maybe some people don't want to do. If we don't learn how to do that, we are not going to win, right? The objective is to take power here. And one way to take power is to elect candidates who are accountable to the movements that we're working in. But we won't get them elected writing about them in our papers.
3 minutes.
Thank you. We won't get elected just having a dialogue about them. I think Danny referred to this earlier, right? What is going to be the biggest pressure? We need to stop having meetings that say, is it Sanders of the Democratic Party or Sanders, that? I said, we are going to be under a lot of pressure if someone like Trump, if Trump or someone similar becomes the Republican nominee, because then it's going to be where, you know, the left is going to be under attack. We're going to be in a lot of bad positions. I think if we have a strong presidential candidate with local candidates throughout this country, whether they're socialists, whether they're in different movements, whether they're Green Party members, we have a ballot line and we have the expertise to run elections. Doesn't mean that we have to be the people in the election. We want that to come from as wide a group of people as possible. And we think that that is going to build a strong independent left movement. My feeling, socialists need to think of the Green Party as their electoral home, right? You can do your work. I mean, if you're an anarchist, fine, you don't vote, right? That's your thing. Cool. But if you vote, or you want to be part of that, using that tool, right, to elect people on the local level. No, we're not going to elect Jill Stein, unlikely. We're not going to elect Bernie Sanders. But we can elect people around this country, and we have done that, who will make, I think, a difference in pushing our movements forward and showing that the Democratic Party is corrupt and that we need an independent party of not only workers, but people who have been disenfranchised for many, many years. Thank you.
Thanks again to the ISO for organizing this and Verso for letting us have the space. Again, thanks to all the speakers. You guys have done a wonderful job. Hopefully I can live up to it. So I'm going to try to be short. Hopefully you can make sure that happens. So I want to start just by saying something that Manning Marable used to say. He said that we get the leadership we deserve or the leadership we demand. But we on the socialist left have gotten neither leadership that we deserve nor leadership that we demanded in the person of Bernie Sanders. We don't deserve it because we didn't build the kinds of dynamic mass organizations necessary to produce that kind of leadership. And Bernie has successfully articulated a sort of critical position that that kind of mass organization should throw up. We didn't demand Senator Sanders because we haven't built the kind of broad-based social movements that typically produce such leadership. While we were at the very beginnings, we've had the kernels of social movement activity with Occupy and with Black Lives Matter. We're not yet at the point where there's mass social struggle and this kind of leadership is demanded by millions of people across the country. In this way, I'm trying to say that Sanders isn't really a reflection of what sort of social movement activity we have on the ground. He's a welcome, albeit really unexpected, intervention. And so I think it's an intervention we really can't ignore as socialists. There's no question that we on the socialist movement have more, as Bhaskar said, we have way more to gain here than we do to lose. And we need a tremendous amount. We need to gain so much, not just in terms of individuals, but in terms of the mass power that we can have in society and in American politics, if we're going to be the kind of force that we want to be in the future. And Sanders' politics are squarely social democratic. However, his analysis is rooted in an analysis of class struggle. And he says this, I mean, he's talked about the ruling class. I don't know how many people are shocked to hear that on national TV, but I was definitely surprised to hear a presidential candidate in the Democratic Party talk about the ruling class. And his critique opens the door to a more fundamental critique of capitalism for those of us who are actually working in and around the campaign. And it gives us the opportunity to articulate a positive vision of socialism that we see as a radical, democratic, and egalitarian future. If socialists aren't making those critiques from a position of genuine support within that movement, I'm sure that we will not have a major effect in directing the outcome of where Sanderistas go after the primaries. But if we do it from genuine support within that movement, we can have an impact on where they go and what they do and how we sort of get involved in this Sanders moment to mobilize hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of young people, a diverse crowd of radical young folks who are thinking critically about capitalism. So we have a moment where hundreds of thousands of voters have been mobilized, not only to reject the sort of ugly right-wing populism of the Republicans, but also the milquetoast reformism of Clinton, and to fight for a positive social democratic program for mass democratic rights and social rights and decommodification. And as limited and partial as Bernie's demands are, they do represent a fundamentally offensive struggle for social rights, and to some extent radical democracy and decommodification. He openly acknowledges that such an offensive struggle for the left actually requires mass social movement. And this is really important. It's not just a refreshing thing to hear, but it's an analysis that requires socialists to get involved in a way that creates that sort of mass social movement. And if we have just a fraction of the sort of power that we need to win even a small amount of Sanders gains, we've made a tremendous leap in the socialist movement. And many Sanders supporters have endeavored to do just that. We've seen Sanderistas ignite a small movement within the labor movement and have captured some really impressive endorsements for Bernie. Not just the likes of NNU, which we sort of should have expected, but a lot of IBEW locals are now fighting about Bernie v. Hillary. And this fight isn't just about whether or not they want to elect a cranky senator from Vermont, but it's about the fundamental role that labor sees in politics. And they're having a debate about that blank check approach they normally have toward Democrats. And I think that debate is really important for workers and for the labor movement as a whole. Thousands of young people are out canvassing and organizing their own Sanders campaigns outside of the apparatus of the Sanders campaign, outside of paid staff, outside of an actual the sort of campaigns that we've seen before, the faux grassroots campaigns we've seen before. And not only they're sort of excited about Sanders, but I can tell you firsthand, they're really excited about this idea of socialism, this idea of an emancipatory, egalitarian future. And these are the people that I think we can win over to the socialist left. We can make into genuine socialist militants for the long haul. And we're only going to be able to do that if we're capable of organizing them within the Sanders movement. It remains to be seen whether the kind of social movement on the scale needed to actually win many of Sanders' reforms will coalesce. But if socialists are not in and around that movement, or the seeds of that movement at the very least, we have no chance of influencing it and to push it toward more broader and ambitious goals. Now finally, a word on the Democrats. Obviously many people are really anxious about Bernie's relationship to the Democratic Party, and that's very understandable, and how such a relationship compromises his candidacy and the possibility of anything genuinely progressive resulting from this campaign. I want to challenge some of these critiques. A lot of them are very good, but some of them I think are often misunderstood or present an overly structural position of the Democratic Party. First, I want to say that, as Bhaskar said and as others said, we do not see, at least I do not see, and socialists that I've talked to working in the campaign, see Sanders as a realignment strategy for the Democratic Party. Right off the bat, that is not something that we are working to. Rather, we see it as a huge opportunity to build socialist momentum out of the campaign. That is, organizing Sanders supporters to become socialists, to join the socialist movement, to become critics of capitalism. So one of the more frustrating arguments against Sanders is that he's merely a sheepdog for Hillary. That is, he's keeping many frustrated left-wing voters in the party and just eventually going to be herding those voters to Hillary's arms when she gets the nomination. Firstly, this argument is really insulting to a lot of those voters who have a mind enough of their own to vote for Jill Stein after the primary. And if not, many of them have made up their mind about voting for Hillary way before Bernie came along. Second, I think the concept of keeping voters in the party is a little problematic. Our two major political parties, our two major political parties are hardly the sort of mass organizations we sometimes imagine them to be. There are no party dues, there are no mass meetings, and there are no party agendas set by the mass majority of those members. In many ways, the Democratic Party is a loose and open organization, and virtually anyone can join and run. Now, it's not to say that building an alternative electoral organization shouldn't be a major part, or the major part, of building the socialist movement, but only to say that Bernie's Democratic primary run does not automatically contaminate many of his supporters. It doesn't make them dyed-in-the-wool Democrats just because they're supporting Bernie in this primary campaign. And if we don't want them to become dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, I suggest we get involved in that campaign and talk to them critically about the Democratic Party and about the party apparatus. Finally, and this goes back to my first point, we haven't really given Sanders good reason not to run in the Democratic Party. The socialist movement is really weak right now. We've not built strong electoral coalitions or organizations that Sanders can count on to help him get his name on the ballot in all 50 states. We've not built the kind of local electoral campaigns that create cadres of city and municipal leaders. We've not built the kind of labor campaigns that have ranks of working class voters going out door knocking for an independent political run. And so we need to do the work, and I agree with Gloria, we need to do the work in the long term to get political movements like Sanders and leaders like Sanders to run in independent campaigns. But right now, we've not given him much of an excuse not to do that. For now, Sanders' run in the Democratic Party represents a major opportunity for the US left to organize and recruit thousands of young radicals to our movement. Building out of the campaign, we can create the kind of powerful force necessary to affect American politics. But we can only do that from a position, I think, of critical but unswerving support from within the Sanders camp. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Kroop, and I'm an organizer with Socialist Alternative. I also work for a healthcare labor union. And it's really exciting to be here, and thanks a lot to ISO and Verso and everyone for hosting, and also opening this up so it can be as broad a debate, reflective of the wide variety of views that actually exist on the socialist left today. I think I want to start by saying that Socialist Alternative believes that we need a party of the working class and oppressed that is independent of corporate cash. And that's why we've actually proudly run a candidate, Kshama Sawant, that probably everyone in this room knows, in Seattle, who just was reelected in November and is one of the few open socialists who serves in politics today. And By using that office, socialists, as we did, use it in a very different way to how the bourgeois parties use electoral office. We use it to build movements. And that's precisely what we did in Seattle when we built a mass movement that included labor unions, community groups, and many others to make Seattle the first big city to go to 15. And we're doing that again as we build an active movement on the ground to fight for affordable housing and action on homelessness in a city that is vastly unequal and where Democrats, the establishment, have controlled the city for years. In fact, Democrats control the vast majority of cities. So the question is, how do we begin to actually build that fight back, build a party of the working class and oppressed? And when we in Socialist Alternative begin to look at Sanders, the key issue for us is that, how do we build independent left politics? Many of the speakers said, look at the position of the left, it's very weak. And although that's true to some extent, I think we also have to look on the positive side, right? Since 2008, there's been Occupy, the Arab Spring, the Wisconsin Uprising, Black Lives Matter, the Fight for 15. There's an upsurge in activity. If we position Bernie Sanders as one new link in that chain, like any other movement, we have to engage in it. But we have to engage in a sophisticated way. And I think that's where I might distinguish myself from what Danny was saying, because his analysis of the Democrats as being corporate controlled is completely correct. But Socialist Alternative, and we believe that that analysis of saying there's a structural problem with it is overly formalistic. And in fact, I would say that if we look to Marx, right, the progenitor of all sort of socialism that is well and good in the world, that idea in the 11th thesis, that it's human activity that is sensuous, that praxis is the way to build and be moving our movements forward, we have to look at Sanders as that type of development, something with which we must engage, but firmly hold on to our own banner and constantly, and I think this is where we can practically think of the Sanders campaign as important, continue his call for a political revolution against the billionaire class. That is not something that we hear very often or ever in the Democrats. Even Jesse Jackson wasn't saying that, and certainly not Howard Dean. So there is something exciting there, and that's why he's engaging millions of people who are radicalizing around this. And let's be honest with ourselves. 2016, that election is going to dominate US politics. So the best way that we can build Black Lives Matter, 15, and anti-TPP struggle and other movements, and to build independent left politics, would be to orient to the Sanders campaign. But we orient to deepen the contradictions within the Democratic Party and to force a split within that party. I think it's unrealistic for us to stand up here and talk about an independent left force without conceiving, as has happened in many countries around the world, that the Democrats would not have a split within them, and that many of those folks, those good activists, would turn to us, would turn to an independent left party of the working class and oppressed, and want to join ranks with us and begin to defeat the corporate democratic establishment that for too long has made it impossible for working class people to get what we need. Okay, thank you. So our position is to work actively with those activists who are genuinely enthusiastic about what Sanders represents, to politicize the contrast between Hillary Clinton, who is the corporate Democrat par excellence, and Bernie Sanders. And I think as this process unfolds, people are smart. They're going to understand if Bernie winds up endorsing Hillary and not running all the way as far as he can, that they'll have been betrayed. And they're going to look for people, for comrades, who fought in that struggle to try to get those ideas of single payer, of pretty good now, because activists called him out on it, program around criminal justice and the types of violence that are committed every day against the communities of color in this country. Those are the types of issues that people are excited about. And so I would just conclude by saying, actually I was reading today that Ben Carson has, I'll just finish on this, Ben Carson has said that if he is ignored, he will run, he will leave the Republican Party. We need to be thinking the same thing. We need to get Sanders to say he's going to leave the Democratic Party, and if he doesn't, we have to be prepared to pick up the pieces and keep fighting for our own party. Thanks.
You need to talk about one kind of engagement is like not letting that system work and shutting down like this many people in a room probably can't swing an election by demographics, but you could shut down rallies, you could start occupations, and I think like that kind of direct engagement needs to be put first and foremost.
Thank you.
I want to say, I think one of the things that we might take out of this is just this event. That is, we don't very often have the people I would say are the organizations of the Democratic left and journals of the Democratic left and so on come together around an issue to discuss this issue. This is itself a very important political development, and we ought to think of a way to carry through out of this event the sense of comradely cooperation, shared objectives. The fact is, all of us are trying to talk to these people in the Sanders campaign. The Sanders campaign, most importantly, represents a tremendous shift in class consciousness in the United States. The fact is, was said, you can talk about the ruling class, the billionaire class, working class people. This is a tremendous shift in consciousness taking place not only among young people and students, but among the tens of thousands of people who signed up to be part of Labor for Bernie. Labor for Bernie, a very important development. And it seems to me in a certain sense that it's almost less important where we fall out on this issue than the fact that we've all fallen together on the issue that we have to move this mass of new political activists to the left and turn them into socialists.
I think, one thing that I'm hearing that I'm confused about, and I'm hoping that we can hear more about from the people who encourage us to support Bernie Sanders materially with our effort, is what that actually looks like. Because Bernie Sanders is, as we all know, not running a social movement. He's running a campaign for president of the United States. And despite how these sort of candidates usually get painted as sort of wacky and disorganized and whatever, it's an incredibly organized operation. I went to the Brooklyn for Bernie Sanders meeting, right? And it was sort of astounding because there's 50 people in a room, and it's exactly the same, the kinds of people that we want to be engaging with. But the discussion started with a go-around that said, what skills or talents do you have that we can deploy to Bernie? And that was the end of what most of us got to say. And the rest of that meeting was saying, we've identified through all of this data and all of these charts, exactly what Gloria was describing. We've identified all the neighborhoods that went green, all the neighborhoods that go left, all the neighborhoods where we think that we can get some Bernie supporters. And what we want to do is flood those neighborhoods physically. We want to be on the street corners. We want to be phone calling everybody. We want to convince them to unregister as Greens and register with the Democratic Party. And that's what we should be doing. We should be out on the streets. If you're confused about it, we will work with you. We will train you, etc. That was every effort. Every single action item for the rest of the meeting was go to one of these different places and figure out how to do that. All of your energy is spent figuring out how to take people out of the Green Party or out of independent parties and put them into the Democratic Party. Now, I think we all agree that Bernie Sanders at some point will not be the nominee.
30 seconds.
Is the plan of the campaign to call those people back up and say, you know what, we gave it our best shot, it's not working out, what you should do is go back to the Green Party? No, of course not. And this is an incredible turnout, right? Of course we're not going to do that, right? So what's going to happen is these people are going to be Democrats. The Green Party's going to have less people. And these things actually matter in terms of how many signatures you have to get, how much effort you have to put. The barriers that the Democrats put up are based on these sorts of things, right? And as incredible as this turnout is, and I think it's amazing, and it's bigger than lots of meetings we've had in the past.
Prosecutor was the first person in 2000 that I voted for president, and joined the ISO shortly thereafter. So I've been a part of a number of campaigns and lead up. And what I find, I don't mean this to be, I hope it doesn't come off wrong. I feel like there's actually sort of in my experience, a naivete about the role of the Democratic Party and their attempt to co-opt social movements that is happening amongst Bernie supporters. For example, my two most stark experiences of being a socialist and an activist since 2000 was one, 2004, in our organization being largely involved in the gay marriage movement. And what happened to the gay marriage in 2004 is that we were told during the campaign season that now was not the time, that we were about to elect a Democrat. The Democratic Party straight up said, now is not the time. You're embarrassing our party. You're actually calling us out for something that we don't support, and you're making us look bad. And if you do that, a Republican is going to be elected. Because the left is so tied to the Democratic Party, that meant that gay marriage was dropped and wasn't won until years later. And thankfully it was won, but it was not to the credit of those organizations that were supported the Democratic Party at the time. The second thing, for people who remember, every March, busloads of people would travel from New York City down to Washington, D.C. to protest the anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. This happened for years. It was a mass mobilization for years. 2007 was the last time that happened. That's because in 2008, Barack Obama was elected president and the anti-war movement tanked. And now we have a terrorist crisis, an imperialist terrorist crisis happening. There's no anti-war movement to speak of. And I think that's largely because the left is tied to the Democratic Party in a way that's allowed the anti-war movement to tank because the Democrat is the one dropping the bombs versus the Republicans. And if our movements, our social movements, which are not electoral movements, the social movements that are trying to actually exercise power, ordinary people, do not break fundamentally for the Democratic Party, then I think that our movements will continue to lose.
I understand that there was some incredible butchery that happened in Iraq and in about 40 or 70 other countries across the world over the last 50 years, and everybody who is old enough and American has failed to halt the genocide by America and by CIA Contras across the world over the last 60 years. And I don't see Sanders putting a stop to that kind of activity. I think that Sanders is just as hawkish is the word that people use, but I consider him just another butcher, and I think he has blood on his hands for supporting the war in Iraq, which killed millions of people. I used a really great source. It's called Wikipedia to learn a lot about the Iraq war. And it turned out that I have some numbers actually. Well, maybe they're on my phone. About 150. Sorry, I'm really slow at this, but I'm just going to have time finding it. Hang on. We had this event in Paris where 200 people died. If that had happened several times a day, every day for 4 years, that would mirror what happened in Iraq over the first 4 years of the invasion. For us to sit here and support Sanders, I can't do that and not throw up every morning, probably. It disgusts me. I don't understand how anybody with a straight face can not bring that up as a central part of his campaign, because there are only two issues in this: the environment and American imperialism abroad. And that is something that I don't know much about his stance on the environment, but as far as killing people in other countries to get us more stuff, I think he's going to keep doing that. I wonder if the panel can mention why that's not something that's central to their feelings about Sanders. Thank you.
The starting point that there aren't movements to be co-opted, and therefore this is the best we can kind of do. I just want to argue, I think that's the wrong starting point. I think there's an entire generation coming into this election who have seen nothing but war, racism, economic crisis, police terror, and devastation. And the gravitational pull towards socialist politics and the gravitational pull towards Sanders' campaign is a reflection of that. And I think we should be in full solidarity with that. I think we should welcome that. I'm shoulder to shoulder with people who are voting for Sanders for that reason. But I think that there's an entire generation of people for whom socialism is being defined right now, not just socialism, but the whole question of what is the alternative to this society, the barbarism of this society. What is it that we can do? And I think that we share in this room, or at least the speakers, a goal of how many people are going to come out of this moment, one, towards a deeper kind of politics, towards a socialist politics, towards a broader vision. And I think it was Dustin who talked about there's a door open. I think the question is how we approach that door. And I would argue that being in the Sanders campaign is not the most effective way for then winning people towards a deeper socialist politics at the end of this process. I think you have to talk honestly to people. And I don't think you can campaign for Sanders at the same time as you're talking honestly about the nature of the Democratic Party, about what Jesse Jackson's campaign represented, about why we've lost abortion rights in this country because the Democratic Party has thrown it down the toilet and feminist organizations have followed right behind. We have to have those kinds of conversations because people need a deeper level of politics to sustain this movement. And I think you can engage openly, honestly, in complete solidarity through events like this, through discussions with people who you might not win today or tomorrow, but I think we can win later. And in that vein, I just want to make a proposal. I agree with Dan completely. This meeting is amazing. I want to see this meeting replicated with the same organizations and speakers and maybe more after the primaries are over and when Hillary Clinton is the nominee, calling on people not to vote for Clinton and for building an alternative. I think we can have a stronger alternative to less radicalism.
Questions for the comrades that are currently supporting the Sanders campaign. You weren't very clear about what happens after August, and I would like to hear, are you going to be working for the Green Party campaign after August, after presumably Sanders does not get the nomination? And then conversely, for the Green Party, for Gloria, what is the Green Party's orientation to the supporters of Sanders now? Is there an effort being made toward them? Are we orienting a lot of efforts to bring them into onto the perspective of the Green Party campaign?
I do think that there are serious questions that should be raised in regards to, the strategic situation. Can we win people when, in New York City, for example, or New York State, it was a guarantee that Cuomo was going to win. I mean, hopefully the the bastard is indicted for corruption soon. Right? But it was a guarantee that he was going to win. So the lesser evil was not such a pull on people. And to be real, I think the lesser evilism is a cynicism, a deep-rooted cynicism that we can't change anything. We have to raise the sights and expectations of working people. And I do think that at the very least in New York State, the Hawkins-Jones campaign helped draw some lines for, at the very least, teachers' unions about who to support. And a lot of teacher locals and unions supported the Hawkins-Jones campaign. And that was super important. And I'm not quite sure if the Sanders campaign can do that, really to that kind of a degree. And I mean, I'm also curious as to what the socialists in the Sanders campaign can show that they've been able to shift Sanders to. Like, what has the socialist alternative or the folks in the Bernie, the socialists in Bernie or supporters for Bernie, what have they been able to shift Bernie on? I think what we have seen though is Black Lives Matter has been able to shift Bernie on some things. And for that reason, I think we have to be involved in the social movements more than anything. I mean, we have to have a position on the electoral stuff, which is why I support, and just like the ISO, Jill Stein's campaign.
I agree very much with what Dan said and others have said. That this is not about who's orienting or not orienting to the people who are supporting Bernie Sanders. This is about how we do so. And I think that I wanted to raise a particular criticism of the idea that we can somehow have tactical, that it's somehow easy to sort of tactically be part of the Bernie Sanders campaign and then with numbers turn out and support Jill Stein afterwards without a negative effect on the left. And I think one of the things that it completely ignores is that there's a 60-plus year history of one of the dominant trends in the U.S. left, that is the history of the Communist Party going back to the 1940s, of being engaged in Democratic Party politics explicitly as part of this project of transforming the Democratic Party or building a popular front bloc or however you want to articulate it. And that those forces very much still exist. I work in the trade union movement, and those forces exist in the trade union movement. And comrades, if you go to Bernie, if you go as a socialist to be active in Bernie Sanders groups throughout the country, you will find activists from those formations in the trade union movement, whether formally or not of the Communist Party or their progeny, who are actively engaged in that process. And if you go to Boston and try to enter the Bernie Sanders Club and say, we want to orient your people, but we don't really support Bernie Sanders, you will be thrown the hell out of there, as some organizations have experienced. So we're not entering a vacuum. And so we need to learn, we need to understand and learn this history and take seriously what the implications are going to be for the generations of young people who are looking to Bernie for the first time. And I think it's a negative one, and we need to stand in principle to build an alternative.
As a lot of people pointed out, the question is not like whether we sort of all share the same ideas. It's about what do we do in this circumstance. And I keep coming back to one thing, which is if I'm a kid right now, hypothetically, or an adult, kids will draw more sympathy for this example, in Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan, I don't really care if Sanders gets elected because he's going to kill people around me. Like, this person, our lesser evil, is somebody's murderer still. Like, I know we're not talking about program as such, but this is a guy who supports Israel. This guy is still somebody's killer. He's saying, I'm gonna go get ISIS. And he's not gonna go just get ISIS. It's gonna be civilian casualties in the same war on terror and the same thing. So then the question is like, well, what do we do with that? And I'm a beer guy. I sell beer for a living. It's a cool job. And one thing that happens that we keep seeing is that these small breweries get bought out, right? They get bought out by these large companies like Anheuser-Busch or whatever, right? And then what happens is Anheuser-Busch will run ads that say like, don't drink craft beer, that stuff is for pompous assholes. And they actively try to destroy the thing that they're bringing in. And that's, to me, a microcosm. The Democratic Party is not a passive thing that we roll up to and sidle up and then we take a few people with us. They actually want to harm us. They want to hurt our movements. They want to shut Black Lives Matter up. They want to shut up Palestinian resistance. They want to shut up the environmental movement. They want to buy these people off. It's not the same, and if we get too close, we are going to come away tainted, I guarantee it.
Yeah, I agree with what a lot of people said, and I also disagree with some things. When I think about Bernie Sanders, I get incredibly angry. And what one person said about how they appreciate that he's talking about, how fucked up the billionaires are and he's against the 1%. And to me, that's not why I celebrate Bernie Sanders because he's saying that. That's why I fucking despise his ass. Because I was part of the single payer movement in 2009 when Bernie Sanders took all the momentum from our movement and said, yes, I support you. I'm for single payer too. And we trusted him. And we thought, you know what? We're going to do all this activism. We're going to coordinate actions around the country. We're going to get ourselves arrested. And Bernie Sanders is going to champion our cause. And when it comes down to cast a vote in Congress, he's going to vote for single payer. And what do you think Bernie Sanders did when that day came? He didn't vote for single payer. And I'm never going to forget that. And you couldn't pay me enough money to go and campaign for him and to tell people that Bernie Sanders represents what I'm fighting for, because ultimately he sold me out on a personal level for someone who's fighting for a reform that actually could have made a difference in this country. I can't trust Bernie Sanders. I hear what people are saying, and I'm in solidarity with people that support him, but I think that we need to be clear about what Bernie Sanders represents, and not naive about what he represents, because he's dangerous to our movement.
30 seconds.
And I'm all about telling people that.
I just want to echo in the case that it gets lost, the question earlier that I forget your name, about whether this engagement with Bernie Sanders' campaign is a cultural sort of engagement, that is that we're trying to get a question of what it means to be a socialist and whether that's an identity framework. I think that's a confusing question that we need to approach about whether or not we're asking like a question of are we just trying to create a cultural change in what socialism is, or actually trying to build socialist organization? And then the second question I want to ask is a lot of the comrades who've been speaking about working for the Bernie Sanders campaign and have been operating on this assumption that Bernie is going to lose the primary. My question is, what do we do if he wins the primary?
We all need that here.
And, Bernie has to shift to the right more to appease everyone else. So, what does that look like?
I think that there's a lot of agreement about the engagement with Sanders supporters. You can call it solidarity with them, you can call it grab them, whatever you want. But there is an orientation towards this, because if you're a socialist in the US today and you don't orient towards this phenomena in any way, you are not a socialist in this country, really. You're a very weird person, actually, if you ignore this thing. It's important to explain. Socialist Alternative, for example, doesn't have any illusions that Sanders actually can win. It's possible, but extremely, extremely unlikely. We don't have any illusions that he will run independently after or support even the Green Party or anything like that. We think he will support Hillary Clinton. And for that reason, we will have a war with Bernie Sanders later on. And I think it's important to understand that and to prepare for that. But right now, we are small, as many said, in the US. But if you go to Bernie, people for Bernie or Labor for Bernie or whatever it is, and you say, I'm from a socialist X, and I support an independent working class party in this country, and I'm against Hillary Clinton and so on, you will most likely get an applause and not booed, from our experience in these groups. So there is this whole openness for the left to intervene pretty heavily. So what is the best way, actually, to take
30 seconds.
Thanks. To take this crack of the Democratic Party that does start to exist right now and make it into a bigger crack? And I don't think we have the force to actually make a huge split right now in the Democratic Party, but we can do the best that we can right now. Is to actually to get into this campaign, to talk with all these people, and to fight with Bernie Sanders over these people, because, as people said, he will tell all these people to support Hillary Clinton later. If we do nothing, that's what will happen. It's our job to actually go in there. Thank you.
If Bernie Sanders wins the Democratic nomination, I will cheer. And I think we should all cheer. And we should cheer about the fact that 700,000 people have made a contribution. That if he lasts in the primaries through June, more people will have voted for him than voted for Debs. And this is something that socialists should cheer and should work to take advantage on to build after. And it's not up to Bernie Sanders about what comes after. It's up to people who work and work with him. Now, one thing that I have learned is that politics is about principle and relationships. And if you want to take people who are part of that movement, if you want to relate to those 700,000 people, then you have to have a relationship with them. And it's got to be a relationship that's built on trust and support. Thank you.
We've been talking about whether we should support Bernie Sanders or not, whether we should work for his campaign or not. But the fact is, there is a campaign. And so I guess the challenge for all of us is, what is the opportunity? And I'm particularly interested to hear from people who are not supporting Bernie Sanders, because I think it's less obvious. What is the opportunity of the Bernie Sanders campaign? And from the people's movement perspective, you know, we've seen Black Lives Matter engage, we've seen other activists engage, but you know, let's use this opportunity and think about how we can do that best.
But I'm going to try to analyze some of the broader themes I think that came up. So a couple of the questions people ask, what does it actually look like to work in the campaign or around the campaign? That's an excellent question. So in Philadelphia, where I'm from and where I do the work, what it looks like is a lot like what we're doing as socialists when we're educating and agitating outside of the Bernie Sanders campaign. The difference is that we have 120 people showing up to an event and more people interested in what this means, what it means to be critical of capitalism than we did before the Sanders campaign. So I think that when it comes to actually what the work looks like, it doesn't look much different from what ISO and DSA and SA are doing in the day-to-day. The difference is just that we have a new audience of young people who are critical of capitalism and who are interested in a new way forward. So that's one answer to that. And in terms of what the campaign itself is doing, so DSA and other socialists that are working in the campaign are not, taking orders from the Sanders campaign. That's not what I mean by getting involved in the campaign. It means getting involved in a lot of the grassroots groups that are going on. So we are not doing the kind of stuff that somebody said, I think it was you said, sort of calling people up and telling them to become Democrats.
Thanks so much for giving Socialist Alternative and myself some time to speak. That was a great discussion, and I really look forward to having more discussions like that with people in this room and many more people to come. There were so many things said, and so I just want to kind of condense my 1.5 minutes now to something that's kind of been, these things that have been contrasted here, which is the idea of like voting or an electoral activity and building movements on the other side. I firmly believe, much in line with what the gentleman in the back said, that everything is based on relationships. And as small forces, we need to think of voting and movements as interrelated. They build on each other. And I think if we adopt an abstentionist policy towards Bernie, we're missing out on literally tens of millions of people who have been excited by someone calling for a political revolution against the billionaire class. That's unheard of. It really genuinely is unheard of. And I think what we need to do is accept all of his limitations, particularly what the brother said on foreign policy, and be very active in criticizing that. But what we really need to do is think about how we build and politicize the conversation happening within Bernie groups. I was just at the Team Bernie NY meeting last week. They had 60 people there. It was a really diverse crowd of people who are getting radicalized, who are engaged, and a lot of them are involved in other movements. And so what our task is in the next period is to use this election like we use other types of activity to help build movements. Because even, and Julian, you said, we will support Jill Stein if she is the strongest independent left candidate left standing on election day. But what even happens if President Stein gets elected? She'll still have a Congress made up of Republicans and Democrats. And so the task then immediately comes back to building movements. And what we need to do is think, how do we get candidates from Black Lives Matter to stand in their local city council districts against corporate Democrats? They're everywhere in this city. So these things can work together, and we need to start pulling people from wherever they are radicalizing to make the biggest impact.
Great. So it sounds like it's about answering some concrete questions and a little reality check. So why not vote for Sanders in the primary and Green in the general election? Well, of course, any registered Democrat who would say to me, who should I vote for in the primary, I would say Bernie Sanders, of course, right? And I would encourage that, and I think that's important, and many Democrats as possible should do that. I'm not going to say you shouldn't bother, you should change Green, you should do all these other things, and I said, but of course, and Jill herself, if you want to know how we orient at this point to the Sanders campaign, has said, in fact, there's a wonderful article that just came out, I guess in Socialist Worker, is that where the article, right? Where Jill says there are many similarities. There are some really important issues that Sanders is raising. Gives him a lot of props for the kinds of things he's talking about income inequality and you know, the 1%. We didn't talk about the differences, which we have very strong differences in terms of especially foreign policy, just because I think there was not time for that. We were trying to get at other points, but they are very important to us. And I think they should be important to everyone in this room. But yes, we say vote for Sanders in the primary, but when that likely result happens, that he is not in it, for supporters, Jill is saying there's a plan B, and we need to talk to people about what that plan B is. And so how is that getting balanced? You know, is what we have to think about. You know, it's nice to hear what's happening in these kind of more rah-rah dialogue meetings and the Sanders meetups. But what Jason talks about is very real. Now that happened for New York because there's a purpose in New York by a certain time frame. In other states, it's going to be other things. But that's the nitty-gritty of the campaign. We are a great talk shop. I'll include myself in that, and I hope we continue talking into 2016 together, all these groups and these publications and all of us parties together. But how many people in this room know how to do the work to get someone elected? Whether it's president, or whether it's city council, or whether it's your, you know, your village alderman, if you're outside of New York City. That's what I'm saying you need to learn, and I'd like you to learn that in Green Party campaigns. Yes, we are recruiting Black Lives Matter to run in 2016, because even though all the eyes are going to be on the presidential campaign, there's going to be other people to vote for. And those people are really important. We now have 2 speakers, leaders of the most corrupt state assembly and Senate in the nation. Guilty. That is amazing. So, you know, I think there's a lot to do outside the Democratic Party. We don't feel we have to criticize Bernie Sanders. I think that we can talk to people who are interested in the Sanders campaign and curious about it and excited by it. But I don't think we have to go in there into those meetup groups and talk about it. Maybe it's different for those of you who are in organizations, right? I'm a leader of a political party who is making their contribution to building that. Do I think the Green Party in the future is going to be the mass, big, left, independent party? No, but it's going to be a vital part of it, and it's going to teach many people how to do that kind of work. I just want to see, did anybody say anything I did not? You know, and I guess the other reality check is, you know what, we're not talking to tens of thousands of Bernie supporters. That's not happening. You just made a point that there are 2,000 socialists in organized groups in the entire country. We're not talking to 10,000 people, right? We're talking one-to-one, we're building relationships, and so we have to decide as a small group of people where that energy goes, what places we talk to them. Do we talk to people who are interested in, like Bernie Sanders with their button at a Black Lives Matter rally? Yes. Do I want to go to a meeting that Jason described? No. You know, so I think that, you know, people have to make their own choices about that. And, you know, there are mechanics to running and taking political power in the electoral arena, and I think we need to do it with candidates who come out of movements. I think that they are synergistic, movements and building independent political campaigns and a movement, and I don't think that happens in the Democratic Party.
I messed up the order, so when I was doing my notes, I wrote on everything, Dustin, Dustin, Dustin. I was just gonna say like 5 sentences and then have him say the rest, but he went first. So again, my notes are a bit disorganized. But to answer the question, what would we do if Sanders won? I would be some sort of assistant commissar of barley and grain distribution. And the first thing I would do is expropriate small breweries, because they're we would have just great mass-produced beer. We'd like Bud Light Lime is now, but 10 times better. But in all seriousness, I mean, I think this is actually a key distinction. I don't support lesser evilism, and I don't think Sanders is evil. And we have, you know, I mean, I'm using the word evil, yeah, I'm sure you would use that word, but I think that, in other words, I honestly engage with Sanders, and I honestly, you know, support him along the lines that I laid out. And I think that's important. You know, if you are just hovering into that campaign just to try to get something from it, I don't think you could honestly engage, and that's why I do applaud, you know, I disagree with, but I understand the analysis of the ISO and how they are related to the campaign, and it's, you know, consistent. And I would say that, you know, if you speak to us after, especially Dustin, we could give you more details and evidence on how these interactions actually work for those outside, you know, not supporting Sanders, how they work within, you know, Sanders events and meetups and so on. You know, I could obviously just point to, there has been demonstrable organizational growth and interest and so on as far as, you know, DSA is concerned. I'm sure people involved with DSA even more heavily than myself can also, you know, confirm that. You know, and I do think actually socialists active in the Sanders campaign are communicating with, in various forms, tens of thousands of people. I think even directly. I mean, socialists, if there's one thing about us, one of the reasons why we can't stick to like 2-minute restrictions and Q&As normally, Lichi did a good job keeping us under control this time. We talk constantly. We talk to more than 5 people. So 2,000 of us, we can talk to hundreds of thousands of people. But, you know, and obviously, and to Aaron's question, which is a very good question, you know, it isn't easy. And, you know, it's a tactical decision, and none of this politics in any form, any tactic, any strategy, it's difficult. I would say, though, that Dustin, myself, most of the people I know within DSA, most of the people I know who are socialists active in the Sanders campaign, do oppose the kind of pop front like engagement and realignment strategy and so on that you were laying out. And we do that while at the same time supporting critically the Sanders campaign and also opposing the trade union bureaucracy. And this is a different position. This is not a position that either conforms neatly to the old CP or the old Harringtonite kind of lines of these things, and it also doesn't, you know, map exactly to the types of organizations like Solidarity or the International Socialists that we're also pushing this kind of rank and file approach to labor. So this is just something new. I think a not significant, you know what I mean, definitely, portion of the left, you know, a few hundred people in this very small socialist you know, movement do hold those positions. I think it's a distinct position. You know, I would just, you know, have one bit of caution. I agree completely with what Frank said about politics being about relationships and it being very important if you want to have any influence. It's easier to do it within for that reason. I would say my one point of disagreement is just, you know, a vote for Sanders isn't a vote for Debs, partially because in many ways, there's a certain way in which, let's say, I'll use the example of a flawed, but, you know, an SWP race from 1976, right? So Peter Camejo ran a independent campaign, and let's say a campaign like that might have not netted a lot in terms of like mass support or votes or so on, but the purpose of that campaign was to communicate with large groups of people, to communicate with existing movements, and to do that as open socialists, and kind of what Engels would have called this like a litmus test for the socialist movement, and that's how, you know, he viewed electoral politics of this nature. I think in the same way, if then you remind me of Peter Camejo in some way, at least from his speeches and so on, if you wanted to run a national campaign, and it was on that basis, then, you know, I would support that litmus test. You know, I would support it at that level. I think in the same way, if there's energy around a Green Party campaign like there was around Native, I think definitely that's a campaign worth supporting. So I think it's all, you know, just contingent. What are we going to do in August? We might not do much electorally around the campaign. We might support the Greens. We might encourage Danny or someone else to go, you know, be a writing candidate. Probably not. But we definitely won't be supporting Hillary Clinton.
Look at Bhaskar trying to soften me up right before Fuck you. No, it Okay, it was good. First thing, the question before, why just lay out an analysis of the Democratic Party and all they've done wrong? Why not envision how they can be transformed? For the same reason I can't envision how the Republican Party can be transformed. They're different parties of the 1% that I can. It's the party of World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War, the beginning of McCarthyism, the Red Scare, mass deportation, mass incarceration. This doesn't happen by accident. Yeah, I didn't get into slavery, Jim Crow, internment, Japanese American. Okay, I don't mean to be flip about it, but I do think we have to squarely look that in the face, and I don't think the speakers are avoiding. I mean, I think that's mostly a shared agreement. The question about what if Sanders wins, one thing I'll just say is, because I also don't think it'll happen, obviously, but we have to examine what would be the possibilities. Would it be because Hillary Clinton collapsed in some massive scandal and Bernie Sanders moved to the right enough that he made himself supportable to those superdelegates? Did he put out the, you know what I mean? Or would it be somehow in a circumstance where he was sort of running the campaign he's running now, or even further to the left and under pressure from supporters taking up, imperialism? Who knows? But I really don't see it. I don't see it happening either way, but it's very hard to see it happening other than him making a dramatic shift to the right and Hillary Clinton. Who knows what kind of scam? Okay. So the question of one thing, I thought Dustin spoke really well, but one thing I disagreed with, which I've heard before, is the idea that those of us who say that one of the roles that the Bernie Sanders campaign is in is going to steer people just into the Hillary Clinton, camp, that's condescending to those voters. I actually don't think that's true at all. That's not the process how it works. I want to just tell a story I didn't get to tell because we only had 10 minutes about the 2004 presidential election when John Kerry was debating George Bush, because I think it actually says what the process is, and it's not about people being passive or sheep or whatever. It was in one of the debates. I was in Hunter College watching with a ton of people. We're all booing and hissing George Bush. He was as hated then as Donald Trump is hated now before he took up painting and just being sort of pathetic. And John Kerry, who supported the Iraq War, was looking for a way to show that he was tougher than George Bush. And he said, number one, the borders are more leaking today than they were before 9/11. This being John Kerry. The fact is, we haven't done what we need to do to tighten up our borders, and I will. The fact is, we now have people from the Middle East, allegedly, coming across the border. And we're not doing what we ought to do in terms of iris scans, thumbprint, fingerprint technology. Dick Cheney wasn't talking like this in 2004. This was actually something that John Kerry introduced into the political discussion, that the large border crossing with Mexico, where people cross every day to go to work, was a terrorist threat. We've seen some of that reverberating, but that's not even the part of the story that I want to mention, because it's not just like John Kerry made that happen, but it was so interesting being in this room with so many Hunter students, most of whom were first or second generation immigrants, while we're booing and hissing George Bush, silent when Kerry said that. And I'm talking to some people afterward, and they weren't down with it, but they were like, well, you got to do what you got to do in an election. This is sort of, and some people were even hoping that maybe this would be like a way to score a point. People, when we don't build an alternative for people to go to, and in that 2004 election, Ralph Nader's campaign wasn't people didn't feel like they had an alternative. They're not sheep and passive. It's their active hatred of George Bush and everything that he stood for that led them to figure out how they could justify going along with the kind of crap that John Kerry was saying. That's not about that. People are intelligent people. It's up to us. I think Gloria was mentioning this different discussions. There's just new voters or whatever, and then there's folks on the left. I think there's kind of a different responsibility when you're on the left to create the structures so that people have a choice about where they can go. And to me, and that's where I think the question of yes in general, but not this time, I understand why people are saying it with Sanders with the size he has, but it's never the right time. We have to start building. There's someone I know who's a teacher, I'm in my last minute, who's become an activist in the last year in the teachers union in New York City, and she gives a speech that I've heard her say once or twice that I really like, but she was like, I just was trying to be a teacher. I didn't choose to be a teacher at a time when education was under all this attack from corporate forces and charter schools. You just have no choice, and then you have to start fighting it. And I would also say we didn't choose. None of us chose to live in a country that never developed a labor party, that never developed. But we have to look reality in the face. That our Democratic Party is one of the two parties of capitalism, and I know that sounds rhetorical or jargony, but you see what the reality means every freaking with all of them in power. Bernie Sanders is different than that, I think. Okay, sorry, I'll leave it at that.